In the last hours of February 1704, on the far northern edge of English America, a wall of snow stood higher than a man's head. It had drifted for weeks against the outside of a wooden stockade, packed and frozen by the wind into something hard enough to walk on. The people sleeping inside that stockade believed the snow was their protection. They believed no army could move through a New England winter, that the cold itself was a kind of fortress, that the season had locked the forest shut until spring. They were wrong. The snow was not a wall. It was a road, and it was a ramp. 2 hours before dawn, more than 250 armed men crossed the frozen meadow north of the town. French soldiers from Canada, Mohawk warriors from a mission village near Montreal, Huron, Abenaki, Pennacook, the scattered survivors of nations the English had broken a generation before. They moved on snowshoes, silent, pausing each time the wind died so the crunch of their steps would not carry. They climbed the drift the way a man climbs a hill. They dropped down inside the walls. They opened the gate from within. By the time the sun rose over the Connecticut River Valley, roughly 40% of Deerfield was burning. Around 50 colonists and soldiers were dead in their homes and in the snow. And 112 men, women, and children had been bound, dragged from their beds, and started north on foot toward New France, a 300-mile march through frozen wilderness during which the ones who could not keep the pace would be killed where they fell. This was not a random act of frontier savagery. That is the story New England would tell itself for 200 years, and it is the story carved into the name that stuck: the Deerfield Massacre. But the truth is colder and more deliberate than the word massacre allows. What happened at Deerfield was a planned military operation, executed across hundreds of miles in the dead of the winter, driven by 4 different empires of grief and ambition that all pointed at one small town on the same February night. Battles are remembered for who won. Raids are remembered for who suffered. But the events that truly change a frontier are the ones where every side believes, with total conviction, that they are the ones defending themselves. Deerfield was that kind of event. We remember the village that burned. We forget how many people had a reason to burn it. By the end of this video, you will understand how a town that had been warned, garrisoned, and walled was still wiped off the map in a single hour before dawn. You will understand why the deep winter snow that everyone believed made an attack impossible was the exact thing that made the attack possible. You will learn why a French commander marched 300 miles through the cold to capture one specific Puritan minister, and what that minister was worth alive. You will see the door that survived the fire and still survives today, with the tomahawk scars in the oak. You will learn how an enslaved woman in the minister's own house died trying to shield children who were not her own. And you will meet the 7-year-old girl carried into the forest that morning who grew into a woman, married into the people who took her, and spent the rest of her long life refusing, again and again, to come home. This is the story of how winter became a weapon, how 4 griefs converged on one stockade, and how the line between massacre and war depends entirely on who is telling it. These were the people who lived at the edge of a continent that did not belong to them yet, and did not want to. Before we step into the snow, hit that subscribe button, because the events of one February morning would reshape how an empire learned to fight. Let us walk into Deerfield. To understand the violence of 1704, you cannot begin in 1704. You have to walk backward into the valley itself, because the ground Deerfield stood on was not empty ground, and it was not peaceful ground. It was contested earth, soaked in older blood. And the people who attacked the town that winter were, many of them, walking back toward a home that had been taken from them. The English settlement of Deerfield sat in the Connecticut River Valley, on the ancestral homeland of the Pocumtuck people. This was not borderland the English had discovered. It was farmland and fishing ground and burial country that had belonged to a nation, and the nation was still alive in the memory of the men who came over the snow. The valley had been bleeding for 40 years before the raid. In 1664, the Mohawk attacked and defeated the Pocumtuck, shattering the local nation and thinning the population that held the land. Into that weakened country pushed the English, moving up the Connecticut River the way water finds a channel, founding Northampton, then Hadley, then the others, and in 1673, a frontier outpost they called Deerfield. They did not simply settle beside the native people. They displaced them. The English brought a way of living with the land that was a kind of slow war all by itself. They cleared the forest in great tracts. They turned loose livestock that ran free through planting grounds and drove off the deer. The subsistence networks that had fed indigenous families for generations did not survive the arrival of English agriculture. The land was being eaten out from under the people who belonged to it. That pressure broke into open war in 1675. In the conflict the English called King Philip's War, and the Wampanoag leader Metacom would have called something else entirely: a fight for the survival of native New England. Deerfield was attacked that year. The settlers abandoned it. And just south of the town, at a place the English remembered as Bloody Brook, a column of soldiers and farmers was ambushed and slaughtered, the name itself a confession of how the day had gone. But the valley's deepest wound was not one the English suffered. It was one they inflicted. In May of 1676, English forces under Captain William Turner marched at night to a native fishing camp at Pescompscoot, on the falls just north of Deerfield. They attacked at dawn. The people in the camp were not a war party. They were families gathered for the spring fishing, and when the muskets opened up in the gray light, the English killed more than 300 of them. Most of the dead were women, children, and the elderly. It was not a battle. It was an extermination, carried out against people who were sleeping, and the men who carried it out went home and became respectable. Remember that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Among the young Englishmen at Pescompscoot that morning were Benoni Stebbins and John Hawkes. Both of them would survive, prosper, and settle in the rebuilt Deerfield. Both of them would still be there, grown old, on the February night in 1704, when the snow came alive with warriors. The town that was about to be punished contained men who had helped commit one of the worst massacres in the valley's history. And on the other side of the wall were people who had not forgotten it. For the Wabanaki, the Pennacook, and the surviving Pocumtuck, Pescompscoot was not history. It was a debt. A massacre at dawn, answered a generation later by another massacre at dawn. The English told themselves they were the civilized ones, the settled ones, the godly ones holding a line against the wilderness. The wilderness remembered things differently. The wilderness was keeping count. The men who came to Deerfield did not invent their hatred. They inherited it, and then a war handed it a target. By the turn of the 18th century, England and France were locked in the War of the Spanish Succession, a continental struggle over thrones and crowns that had nothing to do with a frozen village in Massachusetts, and everything to do with why that village died. In North America, the conflict had its own name and its own logic. The colonists called it Queen Anne's War, and it ran from 1702 to 1713. A long, grinding contest, fought not by great armies, but by raiding parties, by burned farms, by columns of captives walking north. The strategic problem facing New France was simple and desperate. France had claimed an enormous share of the continent, but it had almost no people to hold it. New England's population dwarfed the French settlements many times over. The English bred faster, farmed harder, and pushed outward with a relentlessness that terrified the men in Quebec and Montreal. New France could not match that human weight. So it did the only thing it could. It made the wilderness its army. The French survived by alliance. Their governor, Philippe de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, understood that the security of New France depended entirely on the native nations who lived between the French and the English. And he understood something darker too. If those nations ever made peace with the English, if they ever decided that trade with the wealthy, expanding English colonies was worth more than partnership with the struggling French, then New France was finished. The buffer would dissolve. The English would pour north. So Vaudreuil made certain the buffer never had a chance to dissolve. French policy actively fed the hostility between the native nations and the English. French officers organized joint war parties and sent them south into New England again and again, not always to take ground, because ground was hard to hold, but to keep the English bleeding, frightened, and on the defensive, to keep the wound open. A peaceful frontier was the one thing France could not afford. That was the strategy. But strategy chooses general targets. Deerfield was chosen for a reason far more specific. And the reason was a single man held in a Boston jail. In 1702, English authorities had captured a French privateer and naval officer named Pierre Maisonnat, known by the name Baptiste, a man who had done real damage to English shipping and whom the French badly wanted back. To force an exchange, the French needed English captives of equal value, not farmers, not common soldiers. They needed someone whose loss would put pressure on the government in Boston itself, someone the Massachusetts authorities could not simply abandon to the wilderness. They found him in Deerfield. The Reverend John Williams, the town's minister, was Harvard-educated, well-connected, and married into the Mather family, the most powerful Puritan dynasty in New England. A man like that was not just a soul. He was currency. Capture Williams alive, march him to Canada, and you held a bargaining chip the English crown would feel. The raid that was coming had a shopping list, and at the very top of it was the man who preached in the Deerfield meeting house every Sunday, utterly unaware that an ocean's war had quietly written his name on a list in Montreal. It would be easy and wrong to imagine the native warriors in this story as hired muscle for the French. They were not. They were nations with their own grief, their own logic, and their own reasons to march. And for many of them, the French were not masters, but allies of convenience in a much older fight. The indigenous force that came to Deerfield was a coalition. There were Kanien'kehá:ka, the people the English called Mohawk, from the Catholic mission village of Kahnawake near Montreal. There were Wendat, called Huron by the French, from the settlement of Lorette. And there were Wabanaki peoples from the North Country, Abenaki and Pennacook warriors, alongside the remnants of nations the English had already half destroyed. Each of them carried a different reason into the snow. For the Kanien'kehá:ka and the Wendat, the deepest driver was something the English could barely comprehend, a practice scholars call the Morning War. For a century and more, indigenous nations had been dying at a catastrophic rate, not mainly from war, but from disease. Smallpox, typhus, and influenza had swept through communities that had no immunity to them, killing in waves that emptied whole villages. The fur trade and the wars it fueled compounded the loss. Entire families, entire bloodlines were simply gone. And so these cultures developed a way to answer death that was not vengeance, but replacement. They raided not primarily to kill, but to capture. The captives, especially children, were not held as prisoners in any European sense. They were adopted, brought into a grieving family, given the name of a lost son or daughter, raised as full members of the nation. A captive child could become, in the most literal sense, a dead child returned. The demographic and spiritual hole in a family filled by a living person carried in from outside. To a Puritan, this was abduction. To a Kanien'kehá:ka mother who had buried her children to smallpox, it was healing. It was how a wounded people kept from bleeding out. This is why so many of the warriors at Deerfield reached again and again for the children, not to harm them, to take them home. For the Wabanaki, the Pennacook, and the surviving Pocumtuck, the war was about land. It was about the deer driven off and the planting grounds ruined and the towns that kept marching north up their river. Leaders like the Pennacook Sachem Watanuman were fighting a war of territorial defense that the English settlement made permanent and the French simply happened to fund. English forces in Maine had been attacked in 1703, and the New Englanders had answered with their usual ferocity, and the cycle turned again. The Wabanaki sought to halt the encroachment, and they sought captives to ransom for the supplies that a hard northern winter made a matter of survival. 4 different reasons then, walking south through the same snow. A French empire that needed the English afraid. A diplomatic chess game over a captured privateer. A grieving people replacing their dead with living children. And a dispossessed people trying to push an invader back off their land. They did not all want the same thing. They did not even all want the same captives. But on one February night, every one of those reasons pointed at the same wooden palisade in the same valley, and that convergence was about to come down on 300 sleeping people who thought the season had made them safe. In 1704, Deerfield was the last town. Beyond it, to the north and west, there was nothing the English would call civilization, only forest and river and the long road to Canada. The settlers themselves called it the utmost town, the final outpost of Massachusetts, a cluster of homes in a valley ringed by hills and woods that pressed close on every side. It had been resettled permanently in 1682, after King Philip's War had emptied it, and now it held roughly 300 people trying to farm a frontier. It was not a fort. That distinction matters. Deerfield was a civilian village that had wrapped a wall around its heart. At its center stood a palisade, a defensive barrier of upright logs enclosing the town common, the meeting house, a well, and about 15 private homes. Other houses stood scattered outside the stockade, exposed, and in ordinary times their families lived in them. But when the threat of attack rose, everyone was supposed to come inside the wall and sleep within the perimeter, packed together, waiting for a danger that the deep of winter was supposed to make impossible. The society inside that wall was Puritan to the bone. It was governed less by law than by theology, by a strict Calvinist understanding of a universe in which nothing happened by accident, and every misfortune was a message from God. And at the center of that society stood one man. The Reverend John Williams was the spiritual and social axis of Deerfield. Born in Roxbury, educated at Harvard, he had come to the frontier in the 1680s and served as Deerfield's first settled minister, ordained there in 1688. He had married Eunice Mather, a marriage that tied him into the Mather family, the closest thing Puritan New England had to royalty. The Williams family lived in a large 2-story house inside the palisade, and the size of that house said everything about his standing. When the people of Deerfield wanted to understand what God intended for them, they listened to John Williams. The French, for entirely different reasons, were extremely interested in him too. But the Williams household contained lives the history books took a long time to notice, and one of them deserves to be spoken aloud, because her journey is the whole brutal reach of the age compressed into a single person. The Williams family owned 2 enslaved Africans, a married couple named Frank and Parthena. Williams himself had married them only the previous summer, in June of 1703. Of Parthena's life before Deerfield, the honest answer is that almost nothing is documented. The records note her name, her marriage, and that she was about 22 years old. But historians reconstructing the path that could have brought a young enslaved woman to that house have traced a journey that, even as informed reconstruction rather than certainty, captures the staggering reach of the age. She may well have been born in Senegambia, in West Africa, among the Muslim Fulani people. Kidnapped, sold, marched to the coast, and carried across the Atlantic in the hold of a ship through the horror history calls the Middle Passage. She would have landed first in Barbados, been judged too small for the killing labor of the sugar plantations, and been shipped onward, north to Newport, Rhode Island, and finally sold in Northampton, Massachusetts, to a Puritan minister named John Williams. Think about the geography of a life like that. If the reconstruction is even close to right, a child of West Africa, born within the world of Islam, ended her journey enslaved in a frozen Calvinist village at the literal edge of the English world, in a house at the center of a war she had no part in starting. The transatlantic slave trade reached even here, into the deep New England wilderness, and it placed Parthena in a 2-story house in Deerfield in the winter of 1704. Hold on to her. She is going to do something that night that almost no one in the official story bothered to record, and it deserves to be remembered. Here is the cruelest fact of the entire raid. Deerfield was warned. The town knew. And it did not matter, because the people inside the wall trusted the wrong thing to protect them. The warnings had been arriving for months. In October 1703, 2 Deerfield men were seized by raiders while they worked in the fields outside the palisade, a blunt reminder of how exposed the town was. That winter, Peter Schuyler, New York's Indian agent in Albany, learned through his Iroquois contacts that a French and Indian offensive was being planned against the New England frontier, and he sent the intelligence forward to Governor Joseph Dudley. Further warnings followed in mid-February, though none named the target. Dudley responded the way a stretched colonial administration responds, by sending what little he could spare. He dispatched a contingent of about 20 soldiers to garrison Deerfield, under the garrison commander Lieutenant John Stoddard. They were billeted in the cramped homes of the residents, sleeping in attics and on floors, adding their numbers to a defense that already included the town's own men of fighting age under Captain Jonathan Wells. In all, the town could field around 90 armed men. 90 armed men, a wooden wall, and advance warning of the attack. On paper, Deerfield was ready. But you cannot garrison a town against a belief, and the belief that doomed Deerfield was this: that winter itself was a wall no army could climb. The colonists were utterly convinced that large-scale military operations were impossible in the depths of a New England winter. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe, the distances too great. No force could march hundreds of miles through that and arrive in any condition to fight. The season was a moat. The frontier maxim said it plainly, a piece of folk wisdom passed mouth to mouth on the edge of the wilderness. There was no fear of an Indian attack until the oak leaves were the size of a mouse's ear. Until spring, in other words. Until the world thawed. It was a comforting belief, and it was completely false. And the men coming over the snow knew it was false. The very conditions the English trusted to shield them, the deep snow, the frozen rivers, the killing cold, were the conditions the attackers had spent their lives learning to use. The English looked at winter and saw a closed door. The French and their allies looked at the same winter and saw an open highway, paved in ice, leading straight to the gate. The warning had been heard. The wall had been manned. And still the most dangerous thing in Deerfield that February was not any failure of defense. It was a sentence everyone believed. No one comes in winter. They were about to learn what winter could carry. The force that would destroy Deerfield assembled at Fort Chambly on the Richelieu River south of Montreal in the heart of New France. And the man chosen to lead it was taking his first independent command at the age of 35. His name was Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville. He came from a family for whom frontier violence was almost a profession. 4 of his brothers rode with him, a band of siblings carrying a name that the English settlements had learned to fear across 2 generations. Their father, Joseph Francois Hertel, had himself been captured by the Iroquois as a young man, had survived it, and had gone on to lead the devastating 1690 raid on Salmon Falls. This was a family that had inherited the Dawn raid the way other families inherit a trade. De Rouville had grown up inside the craft of it. Now he was carrying it south to Deerfield with his brothers at his side. The force he commanded was a coalition unified by nothing except its enemy. The numbers in the sources vary, as numbers from this kind of warfare always do. But the shape of it is clear. The party that gathered at Chambly numbered roughly 250. About 48 of them were French, troops of the Marine and Canadian militia, who commanded the expedition, supplied the firearms, coordinated the logistics, and carried the specific mission to seize Reverend Williams for exchange. The remaining 200 or so were native warriors, and the largest single block was Kanyakahaka from Kanawake, who would form the core of the assault and came driven by the morning war, hunting captives, above all children, to carry home and adopt. With them came Wabanaki, Abenaki, and Pocumtuck, who knew the country, served as guides and frontline fighters, and came for retaliation and for the land, alongside a smaller contingent of Wendat from Lorette, seeking captives to replace their own dead. As the column moved south through January and February, it was joined by 30 to 40 more Pennacook warriors under the Sachem Watanuman, raising the force to nearly 300 armed men by the time it reached the Deerfield area, closing on a town of 300 souls. The logistics alone should have been impossible, which is exactly why the English believed they were. Moving close to 300 armed men across 300 miles of frozen, trackless wilderness in the depth of winter was a feat that European armies of the period could barely have imagined. The Franco-Indigenous force did it by treating the winter as infrastructure. They pulled their provisions on sleds hauled by dogs. They used the frozen surfaces of Lake Champlain, the Winooski River, and the Connecticut River itself as roads. Walking south on ice that summer would have made impassable water. And they moved on snowshoes, an indigenous technology that the English had never mastered, which let them travel quickly and quietly over snow that would have swallowed a man to the waist. The French understood the value of that technology so well that by some accounts they had placed a large order for snowshoes with their Wendat allies, famed as the finest makers, before the expedition ever set out. Everything the English feared about winter, the attackers had turned into an advantage. The cold was their cover. The snow was their pavement. The frozen river was their highway, running straight as an arrow at the heart of the English frontier. On February 28, 1704, the war party reached the country just outside Deerfield and did something that revealed the discipline of the whole operation. They made a cold camp, roughly 2 miles north of the town. No fires? None. In killing winter cold, with exhausted men who had marched hundreds of miles, they lit no fire, because a fire meant smoke, and smoke meant discovery. They sat in the dark in the freezing night and waited, swallowing their own misery to keep the secret. From a ridge above the settlement, Hertel de Rouville and the native war chiefs studied the town in the failing light, reading it the way hunters read ground. And they saw it. The single fatal vulnerability that made everything possible. The winter snows had drifted deep against the northern exterior of the wooden palisade, packed and frozen by the wind into a hard, sloping ramp that rose against the logs. The wall had been built to be too high to climb. The snow had quietly raised the ground until the wall was no longer too high at all. On the north side, the palisade had effectively lost its height. A man could walk up the drift and step over the top. The defense the English trusted most had been cancelled by the season they trusted most. The wall was still standing. The wall just no longer mattered. Inside, the last line of warning failed in the dark. The town kept a watchman, a sentry whose entire purpose was to catch exactly this. And here the sources do not fully agree, so honesty requires laying both versions down. Some accounts say the watchman was lulled to sleep, that a mother singing a lullaby to a restless child eased the sentry into the warmth of drowsiness on a brutal night. Others say he did fire a warning shot, but that the howling winter wind and the falling snow muffled the sound and swallowed it before it could reach the sleeping town. We do not know which is true. Perhaps both in part. What is certain is the result. Whatever the watchman did or failed to do, the perimeter was open and the town did not wake. The drift waited on the north wall. The cold camp waited 2 miles out. And in the deepest, darkest hour, the hour the English had told themselves no enemy could ever reach, the men on the ridge rose from the snow and started toward the gate. It was a leap year morning, February 29th, 1704, and the attack began roughly 2 hours before first light, in the blue-black cold when human sleep is heaviest. They crossed the frozen meadow in stages, and they crossed it with a patience that is genuinely chilling to imagine. The method was pure discipline. Rather than rush the wall as a mass, small groups darted forward in short bursts timed to the gusts of wind, letting each gust cover the crunch of snowshoes on the crust and mimic its own sound. And every time the wind died, the advancing men froze in place, motionless in the open snow, until it rose again to hide them. Hundreds of armed men, crossing open ground toward a town, advancing in the pauses of a winter gale. Stop. Move. Stop. Move. Closer with every gust. A vanguard reached the northern drift and climbed it without difficulty, scaling the frozen ramp the wind had built, dropping down silently into the enclosure on the far side. They went to the north gate and opened it from the inside. And the rest of the force, 250 strong, flooded into the heart of Deerfield while most of its people were still asleep in their beds. The plan, at that moment, was elegant and restrained. Indigenous war doctrine called for the warriors to surround each house at once, all across the town simultaneously, so that the inhabitants could be taken alive with minimum bloodshed and maximum captives. Surprise was everything. A town taken in its sleep could be harvested, not slaughtered. That was the design. But the design did not survive contact. Somewhere in those first minutes, gunfire cracked out, a shot fired too early, a household waking too soon, and the spell of total surprise broke. The town came awake all at once, in terror, in the dark, to a sound the Reverend Williams would later describe as horrid shouting and yelling that broke upon the town like a flood. The careful surgical operation collapsed into something else entirely. House to house, door to door, axe and musket and fire in the freezing dark. The harvest had become a battle, and the battle had become a massacre, and it all happened in the span of a single hour while the eastern sky was still black. Among the first houses struck was the largest one inside the palisade, the 2-story home of the Reverend John Williams. He was, after all, the reason a piece of this army had walked 300 miles, and the warriors knew which door to break. They came at it with axes and hatchets, hacking through the wood, smashing the windows. Williams woke to the sound of his own house being torn open. He leapt from his bed, shouting up the stairs for the 2 garrison soldiers sleeping in the upper room, and as the first warrior came through into his bedchamber, the minister raised a pistol and pulled the trigger. The weapon misfired. The hammer fell on a charge that did not catch, and in the space of that dead click, John Williams went from a man defending his family to a captive. He was seized and bound on the spot. The single most valuable man in New England, the entire point of the expedition, was taken in seconds because a pistol failed to fire. What happened next in that house is the hardest part of this story to tell, and it has to be told plainly, because it explains the logic of everything that followed on the long road north. The warriors who came to Deerfield were assessing every person they found by a single brutal calculation. Could this captive survive a 300-mile winter march? A strong adult was an asset, worth ransom or worth adopting. But the very young, the very old, and the infirm could not keep that pace. And a captive who could not keep the pace was not a captive at all. They were a liability that would have to be killed on the road. And so the calculation was often made immediately, in the house, in the first minutes. In the Williams home, the warriors killed the minister's 6-year-old son, John Jr., and his 6-week-old infant daughter, Jerusha. A child of 6 and a baby of 6 weeks, judged in an instant, unable to walk to Canada through the snow, and killed for it. This is the cruelty at the center of the Morning War's logic. The same logic that spared and adopted other children spared no mercy for these. To a Puritan father, it was the murder of his babies in front of him. To the calculation of the march, it was the removal of 2 people who could not have survived the journey anyway. Both things are true. Both things happened on the same floor. And then there is Parthena, the enslaved woman who had crossed an ocean in chains to end up in this house, did not run and did not hide. By the accounts that survive, when the warriors came, she put herself between them and the Williams children, trying to shield with her own body the very children of the family that owned her in the last minutes of her life. She was killed there in the house, struck down alongside the 2 children she could not save. Williams himself, in his narrative, recorded only that the raiders carried 2 of his children to the door and murdered them, as also a Negro woman. Her husband, Frank, was taken captive and would die later on the march. The official histories of Deerfield, written by the descendants of the English families, spent 2 centuries celebrating the courage of the colonists. They had remarkably little to say about the African woman who died trying to save Puritan children who were not her own. Say her name. Parthena. She earned it. Not everyone in the house was taken. One of the garrison soldiers quartered upstairs, Lieutenant John Stoddard, the commander of the town's hired guard, threw himself from an upper window into the deep snow that broke his fall. Half-dressed in the killing cold, he bound his feet against the snow and ran, on foot, nearly 12 miles south to Hatfield to raise the alarm. The same drifts that had carried the enemy over the wall now cushioned the one man who escaped to bring help. Winter, that morning, served whoever knew how to use it. Eunice Mather Williams, the minister's wife, weak and exhausted from giving birth only 6 weeks before, was allowed to dress the surviving children against the cold before they were all herded out into the snow. Remember that small mercy. The captors letting a sick woman put warm clothes on her children, because the same captors and the same march would kill her within 48 hours. The frontier could hold tenderness and slaughter in the same morning, in the same set of hands, and never feel a contradiction. not every house fell so fast. At the home of Ensign John Sheldon, the attackers met something they had not expected: a door that beat them. The Sheldon house had a heavy, fortified front door of thick oak, and when the warriors threw themselves against it, it held. They could not break it down. So they did the next thing, hacking at the oak with their tomahawks until they had cut a hole through the planks, and through that hole they fired a musket blindly into the house. The shot struck Hannah Stebbins Sheldon, John Sheldon's wife, as she stood in the hallway, and killed her. She died in her own home, shot through her own front door by an enemy she could not see, because the door had done its job too well, and the only way through it was a hole in a bullet. The raiders eventually got in through a rear entrance, and the house gave up its share of horror. The youngest Sheldon child, 2-year-old Mercy, was killed on the doorstep. But the house also gave up survivors. John Sheldon's newly married son and his bride escaped by leaping from a second-story window into the snow. The son got away into the dark. His wife, Hannah Chapin, injured her ankle in the fall and could not run, and so she was seized and taken north with the others, one more captive carried toward Canada because the snow that saved her husband betrayed her landing. That door survived. It outlived the raid, outlived the burning, outlived the rebuilding of the town, and it still exists today. The thick oak still scarred by the gashes of tomahawks that hacked a hole through it on a February morning more than 3 centuries ago. It sits in a local museum, and if you stand in front of it, you are looking at the exact wood that Hannah Sheldon stood behind in the last moment of her life. Of all the artifacts of the raid, that door is the one that refuses to let the event become abstract. The marks in it are not a story. They are the tool marks of the men who were trying to get in. If the raid had a place where the English wrote their own legend, it was the home of Benoni Stebbins. And there is a grim symmetry in this, because Benoni Stebbins was one of the men who, as a young man, had taken part in the Pescomscoot massacre nearly 30 years before. The valley's accounts were being settled in his own front room. The Stebbins house was built unlike the others. Its walls were filled with brick, and that brick made it nearly impervious to musket fire. Inside it gathered Stebbins and several other men and women, and they did not surrender and they did not break. They fought. The men kept up a relentless volume of fire from the windows, and the women worked beside them, frantically reloading the muskets and casting fresh lead bullets as the supply ran low, melting and pouring ammunition in the middle of a battle so the guns would not fall silent. They were not soldiers. They were farmers and farmers' wives, and they held a brick house against a coalition of 250 warriors. And they made the attackers pay. The defenders cut down several of the besiegers, among them a native war chief and a French officer who, by the witness's account, carried himself like a gentleman. Refusing every offer of quarter, they drove the raiders back again and again, until much of the enemy force had surrounded the house and was pouring fire into it from every quarter, falling back to the shelter of the nearby meeting house to keep up the fusillade. The raiders tried, repeatedly, to set the brick house ablaze and burn the defenders out, and repeatedly they failed. For more than 2 hours, while the rest of the town burned and fell, the Stebbins house held. Benoni Stebbins himself was killed before it was over. But the house never fell. Not to fire, not to assault, not to numbers. It was the one place inside the palisade where the English line held, and it held because of brick and bullets cast by hand and the refusal of a few exhausted people to die quietly. For every Stebbins house, there was a quieter and more terrible end. And it came to the people who did the thing that instinct screams to do. They hid. In the home of the Smead family, as the accounts handed down record it, The elderly widow, Elizabeth Lawrence Smead, went down into the cellar to hide, taking her daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren with her. They were not found. They were not dragged out. They simply waited in the dark below the floorboards while the raid ran its course above them. And then, near the end, the attackers set the house on fire. The 4 of them, unseen and trapped beneath a burning building, suffocated and burned to death in the cellar. An old woman and a young woman and 2 children, dying in the dark of smoke and heat, with the whole weight of the house coming down in flame above their heads. The same fate took the entire family of thankful hawks, who also died hiding in the cellar of a house that was set alight over them. There is no heroism to narrate here and no last stand to admire. There is only the specific, suffocating horror of having done everything right, having stayed quiet, having kept the children silent, and being killed anyway by a fire you could not see coming and could not escape. The cellars of Deerfield are where the raid stops being a battle and becomes simply the murder of families in the dark. We should not look away from them just because they offer no glory. They are closer to the true face of the morning than any defended door. Pull back from the burning houses for a moment and look at the method itself, because what happened at Deerfield was not improvised. It was a form of warfare, refined over generations, and almost every element of it was deliberate. Understanding the design is what separates seeing a tragedy from understanding a tactic. Start with the hour. The attack came roughly 2 hours before dawn, and that timing was not chance. The deepest sleep, the slowest reactions, the longest delay between alarm and defense all belong to that black hour before first light. A town struck at that moment wakes in confusion, in the dark, unable to see how many enemies it faces or where they are. And confusion in a defender is worth more than numbers in an attacker. The Hertel family had been perfecting the pre-dawn strike for 2 generations. Joseph Francois Hertel had led the Salmon Falls raid by the same logic in 1690. His son simply inherited the clock. Then the approach. The cold camp with no fires, the advanced time to the gusts of wind, the snowshoes, the silence. All of it served a single master: surprise. In this kind of warfare, surprise was not an advantage among others. It was the entire battle. A war party that achieved total surprise could take a town almost intact, harvesting captives from their beds with minimal loss. A war party that lost surprise was thrown into exactly the chaotic, costly house-to-house fighting that broke out at Deerfield the moment that first gun went off. The difference between a clean operation and a bloody one was a single early shot, and both sides knew it. That is why the warriors crossed open ground in the pauses of the wind rather than simply rushing the wall. Every silent yard increased the size of the prize. Then the economics, which is the hardest part for a modern mind to absorb. This was a form of war fought largely for people, not for ground. The English thought in terms of territory, of towns held and lines defended. The raiding doctrine thought in terms of captives, because captives were the currency that mattered. To the Kanyenkahaka and the Wendat, a captured child was a family restored. To the Wabanaki, a captured colonist was winter supplies, ransomed back for the food a hard season demanded. To the French, the right captive was a diplomatic lever worth an imprisoned privateer. Almost everyone in the war party had a reason to take Deerfield's people alive rather than dead. And that, paradoxically, is part of why the original plan called for surrounding the houses to capture rather than kill. The slaughter at Deerfield was, in a grim sense, a failure of the plan. The design was extraction. The chaos turned it into a massacre. And finally, the calculation of the march, which governed who lived past the first hour. Because the prize was human and had to be walked 300 miles home through winter. The value of any captive was inseparable from their ability to survive the walk. This is the cold arithmetic that decided the fate of the infant Jerusha and her 6-year-old brother in the Williams house, and the toddler Mercy Sheldon on her doorstep, and that would decide the fate of Eunice Mather Williams at the Green River. A captive who could not survive the road was not a prize. They were a delay, and a delay was a danger to everyone in a column racing a pursuit. The same warriors who carried small children on their backs to keep them alive killed other children on sight. And the difference between the two was not mood or malice. It was a judgment about who could finish the journey. That is the logic that built the horror, and it is worth stating plainly, not to excuse it, but because pretending it was random barbarism is exactly the comfortable lie the word massacre was built to tell. The dawn raid, then, was a complete and coherent instrument. Strike in the dark hour, arrive in total silence, harvest the town for the people who were the real objective, and move fast enough that the human cargo and the pursuit both became survivable. Deerfield was destroyed by a machine that had been running for generations, and every gear in it had a purpose. The colonists never grasped the machine until it was inside their walls, and by then the only question left was who could run, who could fight, and who would be made to walk north. As the sun finally rose, the sky over Deerfield told the rest of the valley what had happened. The burning houses threw an orange glow into the dawn, and that glow was a signal fire visible for miles down the Connecticut River. In Hadley and Hatfield, men saw the light, understood it, and rode. English militia came hard up the valley, and when they reached Deerfield, they joined with the surviving defenders, perhaps 30 men in all, and charged into the palisade. The raiders, who had been burning and looting and binding captives, were caught by the counterattack and driven back, forced to flee out through the north gate the way they had come in. For a moment, it looked like the English had snatched something back from the disaster. The town was retaken. The enemy was running. And then the English made the mistake that turned a recovery into a second slaughter. Flushed with adrenaline and rage, the militiamen did not stop at the wall. They pursued, and in their fury to catch the retreating raiders, they stripped off their heavy winter coats so they could run faster. And they ran out of the palisade and onto the open, snow-covered meadow north of the town, chasing the French and native warriors toward the tree line. It was a catastrophic error, and it was an error about the snow, the same snow that had betrayed the town all morning. The English had no snowshoes. The men they were chasing did. So as the warriors moved lightly over the surface, the English plunged through the crust and floundered, sinking to their waists in the wet, heavy snow. Struggling, slowing, strung out across open ground. Hertel de Rouville had expected exactly this. He had posted a rear guard in ambush along the edge of the woods near the river, waiting. And as the exhausted, coatless, floundering English stumbled into range, the warriors in the tree line opened fire. The volley tore through them. 9 colonists were killed instantly, and others were captured or wounded in the snow. One man took a musket ball in the thigh that he would carry, lodged in his leg, for the rest of his life. The survivors broke and struggled back toward the palisade, and the raiders used the bought time to gather their captives and their plunder and disappear north into the forest. The meadow fight is the whole tragedy of Deerfield in miniature. The English understood courage. They did not understand winter. They charged into the snow without the one tool that made the snow survivable, and the men who had mastered that tool simply waited at the edge of the trees and killed them for it. The lesson was written in blood at the edge of a frozen field, and it would take New England years to actually learn it. By mid-morning, it was over. The raid that had taken an hour to execute left behind a town roughly 40% burned, around 50 colonists and soldiers dead, and one figure that mattered more than any other to the men marching away: 112 captives. More than a third of the entire population of Deerfield was now bound, gathered, and starting north on foot. Hertel de Rouville officially reported his own losses as 3 French killed and 20 wounded, though the true number was almost certainly higher. And he knew with absolute clarity that his greatest danger was no longer behind any wall. It was time. A larger English force would be assembling within hours. Every mile of distance was survival. So the column moved, and it moved fast. And the speed of that march would become its own kind of weapon turned against the people in it. The 300-mile journey to New France was an ordeal that almost defies description. The captives, many of them wounded, exhausted, and in shock from watching their families killed, were driven through deep snow and brutal cold toward a country none of them had ever seen. And here, again, the picture is more complicated than the word massacre allows, because the captors were not uniformly cruel. At the first rendezvous, the native captors handed out heavy winter moccasins to replace the captives' useless English shoes, footwear far better suited to the snow. In some cases, warriors carried the youngest English children on their own backs, the same children they had crossed 300 miles to capture and adopt, now being kept alive and warm by the men who took them. The morning war wanted these children to survive. It needed them to survive. They were the entire point. But survival on that march had a price, and the price was set by the harsh mathematics of a winter retreat. The raiders were short on food and burdened by their own wounded, and they were being pursued. Under those conditions, a single rule governed the column, and everyone in it learned the rule fast. Any captive who could not keep the pace endangered the entire group. A person who stumbled, who collapsed, who could not rise, who slowed the march, became a threat to the survival of everyone, captors and captives alike. And so the rule was enforced the only way the march could afford to enforce it. Captives who fell and could not continue were killed where they lay, dispatched with a tomahawk, to conserve supplies and keep the column moving. This is the engine of attrition that ran the whole length of the road to Canada. It was not random sadism. It was a cold logic of resources and speed, and it fell hardest on exactly the people least able to fight it: the pregnant, the elderly, the sick, the newly delivered mothers, the enslaved man Frank, who all died in the snow over the course of the multi-week journey. Approximately 21 captives died or were killed on the march. Only those with immense physical stamina, or those a captor had specifically decided to keep alive and valuable, survived to see Fort Chambly and Montreal. The most famous death on the road was Eunice Mather Williams, the minister's wife. She had given birth to Jerusha only 6 weeks before the raid, the same infant who had been killed in the house, and her body was depleted, drained, unequal to the brutality of the march. On the second day, the column had to cross the Green River, its waters icy and waist-deep, and as she waded into that freezing water, she collapsed. She could not continue, and under the rule of the march, there was only one outcome. Her Kanyenkahaka captor killed her at the river's edge immediately, and the column kept moving. The wife of the most important man in the expedition, a woman whose husband walked somewhere in the same column of captives, died in an icy river in the wilderness because childbirth had left her too weak to climb the far bank. John Williams would carry that for the rest of his life. For Reverend John Williams, the march was not only a physical horror, it was a theological earthquake. He was a Puritan minister, watching his town destroyed, his wife killed, his children scattered and some of them murdered, and his own body bound and driven north. And his entire understanding of the universe demanded that all of this mean something. So he made it mean something. Williams interpreted the catastrophe through the strict Calvinist lens that governed his whole life. And his conclusion was as bleak as it was characteristic. This was God's punishment, not the random violence of an enemy, but the righteous judgment of a God offended by the sins and the spiritual complacency of New England. The raid, in his theology, was a chastisement his people had earned. He did not blame the French. He did not even, in the deepest sense, blame the warriors. He blamed the failings of his own flock, and he set out to use the suffering as a tool of reform. The native captors, at intervals, permitted Williams to minister to his surviving people. And so, on that march, in the snow, in the freezing nights, a captive minister preached to captive parishioners. He led them in singing what the Puritans called the Songs of Zion, hymns sung by bound people walking deeper into a wilderness they did not expect to leave. He told them their suffering was a divine test, an opportunity for spiritual reformation. And he warned them, again and again, of the threat he believed was greater than tomahawks or cold. He warned them about Catholicism, because Williams understood where they were going. They were being marched into French Catholic country, into a land of Jesuit priests who would work to convert them. And to Williams, a Protestant soul lost to Rome was worse than a Protestant body lost to the snow. He urged his people to hold their faith above everything, to let their ultimate redemption depend on refusing conversion, no matter the pressure. It is a strange and powerful image, and it tells you everything about the world that made Deerfield. A man whose wife has just been killed at a river, whose children lie dead in the ashes of his home, walking through the snow as a prisoner, and using his breath not to curse his captors, but to preach against the religion of his allies. To John Williams, the real war was never between England and France, or between the colonists and the warriors. The real war was for the soul, and it was about to be fought, captive by captive, in the parlors and convents and mission villages of New France. When the survivors finally reached New France, the column that had walked together for weeks came apart. The captives were divided among the various groups that had taken them, parceled out among French households and native villages according to who claimed which person. And that division shattered what was left of the Deerfield families. The surviving Williams children were scattered, sent to different native communities and different French homes, separated from their father and from each other. A family that had gone to sleep together in a 2-story house in Massachusetts was now spread across a foreign country, and which door a captive ended up behind would determine the entire rest of their life. For those who fell to the French, the pressure was religious and relentless. French Catholic priests, the Jesuits, and the Sulpicians set to work on the Protestant captives with everything they had. They used psychological pressure and the deep loneliness of separation. They used the withholding of food. Sometimes they used physical punishment. In Montreal, a circle of devout and prominent French men and women made it their mission to transform these English Protestants into good Catholics, to win for Rome the souls that John Williams had spent the march trying to protect. To these French believers, this was not cruelty. It was rescue. They genuinely believed they were saving the captives from damnation, and they pursued that salvation with a ferocity the captives experienced as a second kind of captivity, one aimed not at the body, but at the faith. For those who fell to native communities, the experience was different in kind. The children and adolescents taken by the Kanyen'kehá:ka and the Wendat were not pressured. They were absorbed, subjected to the adoption rituals of the morning war. They were brought fully into indigenous families as replacements for the dead. Taught the language, raised as members of the nation, given new names and new lives. There was no campaign to break them. There was, instead, something far more disorienting to the Puritan mind. A family that wanted them, completely, as their own, and for some of these captives, especially the youngest, that turned out to be the most powerful force of all. There is a detail in the captivity story that the survivors never wanted to face, and it is this. The longer a captive stayed, the less likely they were ever to come home, and not because the bars got stronger. Because the person changed. The first weeks were the cruelest and the most reversible. A captive newly arrived in New France was still English, still Protestant, still grieving a destroyed home, still counting the days until ransom. Pull them back in those first months, and they returned to Massachusetts as the same person who had left it. This is why John Sheldon's journeys mattered so much, and why the adults, the ones with fixed identities and grown memories, made up the bulk of the 60 who eventually came back. An adult could be held, but an adult could not be remade. They knew who they were. A child was different, and time was the weapon. A 7-year-old taken into a Kanawake family that loved her did not spend years yearning for an English village she could barely remember. She learned a new language until the old one faded. She learned new prayers until the old God grew distant. She was given a mother who had chosen her to fill the place of a dead daughter, and brothers and sisters who treated her as their own, and a name that meant she brings in the corn. Every season that passed wove her more deeply into a world that wanted her, while the world she had been born into receded into a few dim images and a father's increasingly foreign face. By the time the ransom offers reached her, there was no longer a captive to redeem. There was a Kanyankahaka woman who could not imagine why anyone would ask her to leave home. This is the quiet engine that produced the unredeemed captives, and it terrified the Puritans more than any tomahawk. They could understand a child killed. They could understand a child stolen. What they could not understand, what shook the foundations of their certainty about themselves, was a child who was given every chance to return and simply did not want to, because the life she had been carried into was, to her, a better life. The raid took bodies in a single hour. Time took souls over 20 years, and time was patient, and time did not negotiate. John Williams could ransom his neighbors. He could not ransom the years that had passed inside his daughter, and those years had already decided the question he spent the rest of his life refusing to accept. News of Deerfield horrified Massachusetts. Governor Joseph Dudley opened diplomatic channels with Governor Vaudreuil almost immediately, working to ransom the captives back, and what followed was a slow, grinding, agonizing negotiation that stretched across years. At the heart of the effort to bring the captives home was a Deerfield survivor whose own losses made his persistence almost unbearable to contemplate. John Sheldon, the man whose wife Hannah had been shot to death through their own front door. Sheldon made not one but 3 separate diplomatic journeys to New France, in 1705, in 1706, and in 1707, traveling repeatedly into enemy country to negotiate the release of his neighbors and their children. The man who had lost his wife to the raid spent years of his life walking back toward the people who had caused it, trying to undo what he could of the damage. The negotiations were maddeningly slow, and Vaudreuil leaned on a genuine difficulty to explain the delays. He could, he said, return captives held by French citizens, but he had no authority to force his sovereign native allies to surrender captives they had formerly adopted into their families and clans. These were not prisoners France controlled. They were now, by the law and custom of the nations who held them, family members. and the French governor could not simply order a Kanawake family to give back an adopted child any more than he could order them to give back a child born to them. And beyond that, Vaudreuil had to manage his own devout citizens, French believers who were actively trying to keep the English captives in Canada precisely because they had converted them, or hoped to, and could not bear to send a saved soul back to a Protestant colony to be lost again. In the end, the original purpose of the whole raid provided the key. The release of the French privateer Pierre Maisonnat, called Baptiste, by the English unlocked the major prisoner exchange the French had wanted from the start. The man whose captivity had put Deerfield on the target list was the man whose freedom finally opened the door. In late 1706, Reverend John Williams and roughly 60 other captives were redeemed and sailed home to Boston. The minister came back. He came back to a destroyed town, a dead wife, dead children, and a book he was about to write that would shape New England's hatreds for half a century. But he came back. Many did not, and one of the ones who refused to come back was his own daughter. Of the 112 people taken from Deerfield, dozens never returned. They are remembered as the unredeemed captives, and the most famous of them all, the one whose choice broke her father's heart and challenged an entire civilization's certainties about itself, was Reverend Williams's own daughter, Eunice. She had been 7 years old on the morning of the raid. She was taken to Kanawake, the Kanyen'kehaka mission village, and adopted by a family in mourning for a child of their own, who raised her in that lost child's place. And there, slowly, completely, she became someone else. She forgot the English language entirely. She converted to Catholicism and took the baptismal name Marguerite. She was given a Mohawk name, Kanenstenhawi, which means she brings in the corn. At 16, she married a Mohawk man named Arosen, and she built a family and a life with him. The minister's daughter was now a Kanyen'kehaka woman, Catholic, Mohawk-speaking, married, settled, home. And she would not come back. Not for her father's pleading, which never stopped. Not for her brother Stephen's efforts, which went on for decades. The Williams family tried for years to ransom her, to recover her, to bring her back to Massachusetts where she belonged, and Eunice refused again and again. She said she had found belonging among the Kanyen'kehaka. She said she had found freedom there, and the Mohawk community would not force her to leave, declaring that they would as soon part with their hearts as part with her. She visited her English relatives in New England several times in later life, came down from Canada to see the family she had been born into, and every single time she returned to Kahnawake. She died there in 1785, at the age of 89. Reportedly the last living survivor of the 1704 raid, a Mohawk grandmother who had once been a Puritan minister's little girl. To her father, this was a wound that never closed and a theological scandal he could not absorb. The entire Puritan worldview rested on the certainty of English and Protestant superiority, on the conviction that their way of life was God's way, obviously and self-evidently better than the wilderness around them. And here was his own daughter, raised in the most godly household in the most godly town on the frontier, who had been given the choice and had chosen the other side. Not been forced, chosen. She had looked at the life of a Puritan goodwife in Massachusetts and the life of a Kanyen'kehaka woman at Kahnawake. And she had chosen Kahnawake with her whole heart for 60 years. There was no sermon that could explain that away. Eunice Williams, by simply living the life she preferred, exposed the lie at the center of the story New England told about itself. She was not alone in her choice. Other Deerfield captives made the same one. Abigail Nims and Josiah Rising, both taken as children, were married to each other by Sulpician priests determined to make French Catholics of them. And they stayed in Canada, built lives there, and became the ancestors of modern Canadian families whose descendants live on today. The town of Deerfield had been raided to capture souls. It turned out that some of those souls, given a few years and a genuine choice, simply preferred their captor's world to the one they had been born into. That is not the ending the survivors wanted. It is the ending they got. New England did not absorb Deerfield quietly. The colony answered, and the answer reveals how this single raid began to change the way an entire continent would be fought over. The immediate response was retaliation in kind. In June of 1704, only months after the raid, Massachusetts dispatched Colonel Benjamin Church, a hardened veteran remembered as the father of American ranging, on a punitive expedition against French Acadia. Church led 500 volunteers in a campaign that included the raid on Grand Pre, burning Acadian homes, breaking the dams that the Acadians used to farm reclaimed marshland, and taking prisoners specifically to trade back for the Deerfield captives still held in Canada. The logic of the frontier was a closed loop. A dawn raid was answered by a punitive raid. Captives were answered by captives. The valley's older pattern, massacre answering massacre, simply expanded to the scale of empires. But the deeper consequence of Deerfield was not vengeance. It was a revolution in how the English understood the very nature of frontier war, and it was forced on them by the snow. Deerfield exposed a fatal flaw at the heart of English colonial defense. The colonists had built their security around static fortifications, around walls, around palisades, around the idea that you could draw a wooden line and stand behind it. And Deerfield proved, beyond argument, that this was useless against a highly mobile, winter-adapted enemy. The wall had not saved Deerfield. The snow had simply risen over it. A fixed defense, however strong, could always be gone around, gone over, or reached at the one moment its defenders believed themselves safe. The English had been trying to fight a wilderness war with the instincts of farmers defending a fence, and the fence had failed catastrophically. So Massachusetts changed its entire doctrine. The colony recognized that survival required projecting power into the wilderness on the enemy's own terms, moving through the winter forest the way the French and their allies moved through it, fast and light and offensive. This led directly to the rise of specialized units the colony called snowshoe men, ranger companies trained to patrol the deep winter woods, to execute rapid strikes, and to launch preemptive raids of their own against native encampments in Maine and Canada. The English stopped waiting behind walls for spring and started learning to hunt in winter. Figures like Colonel Thomas Westbrook would carry these ranger tactics into later conflicts. And the whole strategic posture of the New England frontier shifted from passive defense to scorched earth, guerrilla-style offensive. The art of ranging, of the long-range wilderness strike, which would run all the way down through the colonial wars to the famous Rangers of the French and Indian War, has one of its taproots in the humiliation of a town that trusted a wall and lost to the snow. Deerfield, in other words, taught the English to stop being the people who got raided and to start being people who raided back. It was a brutal education, paid for by 50 dead and 112 taken. But New England learned it, and the Wilderness War was never quite the same. The most enduring weapon to come out of Deerfield was not a musket or a ranger company. It was a book. In 1707, after his return, Reverend John Williams published an account of his ordeal, and he titled it, "The Redeemed Captive Returning to Zion." It became a massive colonial bestseller and one of the defining works in a genre that would shape the American imagination for generations, the captivity narrative. But Williams did not write a simple memoir of suffering. He wrote a weapon, and he knew exactly what it was for. the redeemed captive was theological propaganda, crafted with intent. Williams used the story of Deerfield to warn New Englanders against two threats he wanted them to fear together, as a single enemy: indigenous warfare and French Catholic influence. The murdered children, the burning town, the march, the relentless pressure to convert, the daughter lost to Kahanawake. All of it was shaped into an argument that the wilderness and the Catholic Church were two faces of the same darkness pressing in on God's chosen people. The book hardened anti-French and anti-Catholic sentiment across the English colonies. It drew ideological lines in the mind of New England that would still be sharp half a century later, when the French and Indian War came. Lines that helped a scattered set of colonies understand themselves as one Protestant people with one Catholic enemy. Here is the irony that runs underneath the book. The man who wrote it had walked the march alongside captors who carried his neighbors' children on their backs and gave them moccasins for the snow. His own daughter would spend a long and apparently happy life among the very people the book taught readers to fear. But the narrative had no room for that complexity, because complexity does not harden ideological lines. A villain does. And so the redeemed captive flattened the four griefs that built the raid into a single, satisfying shape: the godly captive among the savage and the papist. And that shape did its work on the colonial mind for 100 years. The first draft of how Deerfield would be remembered was written by the man with the most reason to remember it as a massacre, and the least reason to remember it as a war. In the long aftermath, the descendants of the survivors took control of the memory, and they built it into a monument to themselves. In the late 19th century, the families of those who had lived through 1704 worked hard to fix the event permanently in the American historical imagination. In 1870, they founded the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association to preserve the artifacts of the raid, including that scarred oak door from the Sheldon House, and to construct a particular kind of story, a narrative of Anglo-American martyrdom and resilience, of innocent Christian settlers struck down by savagery and rising again. It is a powerful story, and for a century it was the only story, and it gave the event the name it carried for generations: the Deerfield Massacre, a word that contains a whole world view. Massacre means innocence on one side and barbarism on the other. Massacre means there is nothing to understand, only something to mourn and to avenge. And in the last several decades, modern historians have taken that word apart. Contemporary scholarship has largely set aside the term Deerfield Massacre and replaced it with a colder, more honest phrase: the raid on Deerfield. That change is not academic fussiness. It is the recovery of everything the word massacre was built to hide. To call it a raid is to recognize that the French and their indigenous allies were not committing a random act of barbarism, but executing a coordinated military operation, planned across hundreds of miles, with strategic objectives and disciplined tactics, entirely within the brutal but real rules of colonial warfare. It is to recognize that the warriors who came over the snow were fighting for territory that had been taken from them, replacing families that disease and war had destroyed, and answering massacres their own people had suffered, including one committed at dawn, a generation earlier, by men who were sleeping inside Deerfield's own walls that night. The shift from massacre to raid is the difference between a story with a villain and a story with a history. Step back from the burning houses and look at what actually converged on Deerfield that morning, because it was never one thing, it was four, and they had almost nothing to do with each other until the moment they all arrived at the same wall. There was the grief of an empire. New France, too few to hold what it claimed, terrified of an English peace that would erase it, sending war south year after year, not to win ground, but to keep a wound open, because an open wound was the only thing keeping the English off its throat. Deerfield burned in part because France could not afford for the frontier to be calm. There was the grief of a diplomat's arithmetic, a privateer named Baptiste sitting in a Boston jail, and a minister named Williams sleeping in a Deerfield bed, and a cold equation connecting them across 300 miles of snow. Williams was taken because France needed something to trade, and a Harvard-educated mother-in-law was worth more than a town full of farmers. Deerfield burned in part over a prisoner exchange. There was the grief of the dying nations, the Kanyankehaka and the Wendat, hollowed out by smallpox and typhus and the wars of the fur trade, reaching into the English world to carry living children back into the holes that death had torn in their families. Deerfield burned, in part, because grieving families on the St. Lawrence needed sons and daughters to replace the ones they had buried, and the morning war told them where to find them. And there was the grief of the dispossessed, the Wabanaki and the Pennacook and the last of the Pocumtuck, watching English towns march up their river, watching the deer driven off and the planting grounds ruined, remembering Pescumscut and Bloody Brook and 100 smaller thefts, fighting a war of return against an invasion that never stopped coming. Deerfield burned in part because it stood on stolen ground, and the people it was stolen from had not agreed to forget. 4 griefs, 1 gate, and the people sleeping inside that gate experienced all 4 of them as a single, incomprehensible horror that arrived in the dark and took everything. That is the truth the word massacre cannot hold, and the word raid only begins to. Deerfield was not the story of innocent people and savage enemies. It was the story of a continent in which everyone, the French, the English, the Mohawk, the Wabanaki, the enslaved, the minister, was carrying a grief and a claim. And the claims could not all be true at once, and so they were settled the way claims were settled on that frontier. In fire, before dawn, in the snow. War remembers its leaders and forgets its people, and Deerfield is no exception. Some of those it forgot deserve to be pulled back into the light. Hertel de Rouville, who led the raid, lived on and went on raiding, a professional of frontier violence to the end. Vaudreuil governed and maneuvered and got his privateer back. John Williams became famous, published his book, remarried, lived out his life as the survivor whose words shaped how everyone else would remember the morning he barely lived through. These are the names the histories kept. But say the others. Parthena, the young enslaved woman whose journey to that house can only be reconstructed, but seems to have run from West Africa across the Middle Passage in chains, sold and sold again, ending in a Massachusetts village she had no reason to call home, and who died there trying to shield children of the family that owned her. The official histories had almost nothing to say about her for 200 years. Her name survives mostly as a line in an inventory of a minister's property. She was a person. She made a choice in the last seconds of her life that most of the celebrated heroes of the raid were never tested to make. And she made it for children who were not her own, in a country that was not her own, in a war that was not her own. She is worth more than a footnote. Say Frank, her husband, taken captive and killed somewhere on the road north, one of the 21 who did not finish the march, an enslaved man who died walking toward a freedom that was never going to be offered to him at the other end. Say Eunice Mather Williams, dead in the Green River on the 2nd day. A woman whose body failed because she had given birth 6 weeks before to a daughter who was already dead. Say the Smead family and the Hawks family in their cellars, who did the sensible thing, the quiet thing, and burned anyway. And say Eunice Williams, who lived the longest of any of them, 89 years. almost all of them as Canist and Howie, and who answered the entire question the raid had asked, the question of whose world was better, by choosing, with 60 years of freedom, to change her mind, never to come back. War buries individuals beneath the weight of larger stories. It is worth the effort to dig a few of them out, because the larger story is made entirely of them, and it means nothing if their names are gone. Deerfield is small. 50 dead, 112 taken, one village among hundreds. Set beside the great battles of history, it barely registers. And yet it keeps being studied, keeps being retold, because the things it teaches do not depend on scale, and they have not expired. It teaches that a defense built on a single belief is only as strong as the belief, and that the most dangerous assumption an enemy can hold is the one they have stopped examining. Deerfield trusted the season. It manned its wall, garrisoned its homes, heeded its warnings, and still died. Because underneath all of that preparation sat one sentence no one questioned. No one comes in winter. The attackers did not defeat the wall. They defeated the sentence. Every fortress in history has had a sentence like that, hiding inside it. And the clever enemy is the one who finds it. It teaches that the same conditions can be a shield or a weapon, depending entirely on who has learned to use them. The snow that the English saw as a moat, the French and their allies saw as a road. The frozen river that locked the English in their valley was the highway that brought the enemy to their gate. Nothing about the winter changed between the two armies. Only the knowledge of how to move through it. Advantage, on a frontier, belongs not to the side with the better position, but to the side that understands the terrain more honestly. And it teaches the oldest and hardest lesson of all, the one underneath the change from the word massacre to the word raid. It teaches that on a contested frontier there is rarely a clean villain, because everyone believes they are defending something, and usually they are. The grieving Mohawk mother and the murdered Puritan child are in the same story, and that story does not resolve into a side. The men who slept inside Deerfield's wall had helped slaughter sleeping families a generation before. The men who came over the wall were carrying their own dead and their own stolen country. To understand Deerfield is to give up the comfort of a simple verdict, and to sit with the fact that the worst things human beings do to each other are very often done by people who are certain they are the wronged party. That discomfort is the whole point. A frontier is just the place where two righteous angers run out of room and meet. Deerfield was not wiped off the map. That is the strange final turn of the story. The raid burned 40% of it, killed 50 of its people, and marched a third of its population into the wilderness. And yet the town survived, was rebuilt, and stands today. The English did not abandon the frontier they had bled for. They came back, raised new houses on the burned lots, manned the wall again, and went on living at the utmost edge of their world. You can walk through it now. The village still exists in western Massachusetts, near the Vermont and New Hampshire borders, a quiet place of old houses and long fields. There is no battlefield to visit in the way there is for a great war. No monument standing where the meadow fight was fought. No marker in the snow where the column of captives started north. The ground where the Smead family suffocated in their cellar is somebody's lawn. The meadow where 9 coatless militiamen died floundering in the drifts is farmland. But the door is there. The thick oak door from the Sheldon house, with the hole hacked through it by tomahawks and the gash where the musket fired through and killed Hannah Sheldon in her own hallway, survived the burning and the rebuilding and 3 centuries of time. And it sits now in a museum in the town it belonged to. People stand in front of it every year. Most of them have never heard of Queen Anne's War or the Morning War or Pierre Maisonnat de Baptiste. But they look at the marks in the wood, and the marks do something that no plaque and no narrative can do. They make it real. A person stood behind that door. Other people, full of their own grief and their own reasons, hacked through it to get to her. The wood remembers what the histories argue about, and in Canada, the other half of the story lived on too, the half that never came home. The descendants of Eunice Williams, of Abigail Nims, and Josiah Rising, of the unredeemed captives who chose a different world, are alive today. Canadian families, some of them Mohawk families, carrying English Deerfield blood that walked north over the snow in 1704 and simply never walked back. The town that was raided to capture souls gave a permanent part of itself to the people who raided it. And that part has been living quietly in another country for 300 years. The longest and gentlest consequence of one violent morning. We began with a wall of snow. The people of Deerfield looked at that snow, drifted high and frozen hard against their wooden palisade, and they saw protection. They saw the season that closed the forest, the cold that no army could cross, the deep winter that made them safe until the oak leaves came back in spring. They built their whole sense of security on it. There was no fear of attack, the old maxim said, until the oak leaves were the size of a mouse's ear. They believed the calendar was a wall. They feared the wrong season, and they trusted the wrong thing. And the thing they trusted is the thing that killed them. Because the men who came over the snow did not fear winter. They had spent their lives learning it. They knew the frozen river was a road, and the deep snow was a pavement, and the drift against the north wall was a ramp the wind had built for them, free of charge. Everything Deerfield trusted to keep the enemy out, the enemy used to get in. The season was never a wall. The season was a door, and the door had been standing open the whole time, and only one side knew it. 50 dead in the houses in the snow. 112 bound and marched into the dark. 21 of them killed on the road north, dropped where they fell. An old woman, a newborn's depleted mother at the edge of an icy river. An enslaved man walking toward a freedom that did not exist. Children carried off to fill the graves of children on the St. Lawrence. A minister preaching against Rome in the snow with his wife dead behind him. A daughter who would choose her captors for 60 years. A door full of tomahawk marks in a museum. 4 griefs that all came due on the same February morning at the same wooden gate. History gave it a name that hid most of that. It called it a massacre, and the word was a kind of wall too. A way of keeping out everything that complicated the story, everything that asked the people who suffered to understand and the people who attacked. Modern history took the wall down and called it a raid. And behind that plainer word stands the harder truth. A coordinated act of war, fought by people who all believed they were defending something, on ground that everyone claimed and no one could share. The trenches and walls of the great battles get studied in military academies. Deerfield gets studied for something quieter and more useful. The lesson that does not depend on armies or numbers at all. It is the lesson that a frontier punishes certainty. The colonists were certain of the season, certain of their wall, certain of their God, certain that their way of living was so obviously right that the wilderness could only be an enemy and never a choice. Every one of those certainties failed them. The season let the enemy in. The wall was a ramp. The God they trusted was, in their own ministers' telling, punishing them. And the wilderness they were certain no one could prefer took their 7-year-old daughter and gave her a life she would not trade, not for 60 years, not for her own father's tears. The snow they trusted is still there every winter, drifting against the rebuilt houses, harmless now, beautiful even. The same snow that once rose silently against a wall until the wall did not matter. It does not remember the night it became a road. Snow never does. It just falls and drifts and waits. The way it waited 2 hours before dawn on the last morning of February in 1704. While 250 men crossed a frozen meadow in the pauses of the wind, toward a town that had heard every warning, manned every post, and still slept. Because it had told itself the one comforting lie that every doomed place eventually tells. Not in winter. Never in winter. They were wrong about the season. And the season took everything they had.